Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to part 2 of my series of videos where I take a look back at some of the books in my collection that I have less than fond memories of, to figure out if the books are as bad as I remember them or if just nearly 2 decades of negative thoughts towards them have sort of created a mountain out of a molehill. The first video in the series that I looked at was the 3.0 Psionics Handbook, and that one was actually worse than I remembered it as being. But today we're going to take a look at Libris Mortis, the Book of Undead. And to my friend, known as Kamikaze Kid over on Twitch, I just want to say, I'm sorry, dude, but you kind of mentioned this in that Psionics Handbook video, so you had to know that the second you asked me to go easy on this book, it had to be the next one that I looked at. So Libris Mortis released in October of 2004, so it was one of those Halloween-themed releases, and it's the second in what I guess is referred to as the Monster Ecologies series of books for D&D 3.5. This book released prior to this, that is sort of grouped into that same category, would have to be the Draconomicon, the Book of Dragons. Now, the Draconomicon is widely considered to be one of, if not the best source book or supplement released for 3rd edition 3.5 D&D. This is a book that a lot of people look back very fondly on, and it's one of my favorite D&D books of all time. So knowing how much I loved the Draconomicon, when there was a Book of Undead announced in that same vein, I was super excited because behind like beholders and mind flayers, undead are like my favorite creatures. Like I've always wanted to run campaigns filled with like undead, nations or antagonists. The Age of Worms campaign path for 3.5 was one of my favorites, just based on the fact that it was very heavily centered around undead. So I was super excited for this book. The Draconomicon had like 50 pages of just like your basic ecology information, like physiology, society, stuff like that. Now, with this book, what I was really hoping for were some chapters or some sections dedicated to some of the more iconic types of undead, like, liches, vampires, ghouls, ghast, wights, wraiths, death knights, and like going over some of their like creation myths, or like, how was the first lich ever created? How was the first Death Knight ever created? Like, just to sort of go over some of those histories and really kind of flesh out, no pun intended, some of these undead types. Like, give them a little bit more history, give them just a little bit more world building that you could use to enrich your campaigns. So I was really excited for that when this book came out. And was any of that in here? Well, no. Let's just take a quick look at the table of contents here before we do a quick flip through. Not going to be a comprehensive flip through, but I just want to take your attention to the table of contents. So in the Draconomicon, the ecology section, like the All About, which we have like All About Undead, that was about 50 some odd, that was close to 50 pages, and your DM information, including the ecology and physiology stuff, and then just other stuff that the DM should know about, like dragons and all that stuff. Like, that took up the first 100 pages of the Draconomicon before we ever got to a single piece of player character options like we have, which we do have in the Draconomicon. In this book, we have All About Undead, which starts on page 5 and ends on page 22. And then on page 22, we have the beginning of player character options. So this book basically just does not have a lot of flavor text here. Like, the Draconomicon was a very fun book to read because of all the ecology, because of all the fluff information, if you want to call it that. This book is a lot more just basic crunch, and it feels like it's lacking any real, I want to almost say personality. Like, there's just no, and again, no pun intended, it just feels like there's no life in this book. Like, the player character stuff starts on page 23 and goes all the way to page like 80. So that's like almost 60 pages worth of player character information in a book that's less than 200 pages. And a lot of the remaining pages are dedicated to like the bestiary section with just a whole bunch of new monsters. So again, you're not getting a lot of actual flavor text or flavor to use to build up your campaign world. you're basically getting a little bit of stuff, and then new player character stuff, some new monsters, and then you've got a few sample types of a few undead at the end of the book. So yeah, so like again, the All About Undead section doesn't really focus on all the undead. Like the creation of undead section of this All About Undead is less than a page long and is shorter than some information on running hauntings if you wanted to do that for like a horror themed sort of adventure. So again, it's just really kind of weak, right? I'm sorry, I don't know how else to say it. The section on undead metabolism is probably my favorite part of the entire book because it does go over the fact that some undead, they do like eat the living or they do feed, but some of them really don't need to. It may not be required, or they may have a craving for it, but the craving is, it's a psychological thing. And then you also have like some undead that are dependent on dependent on having like that sustenance. And if they don't receive it, then they can actually go into basically like a comatose state. Like it doesn't destroy them, but basically they kind of shut down if they can't get what they need in terms of sustenance, and then they have to either, they have to get it. So that was actually a pretty cool section of the book, but again, it's also kind of short. The actual text that goes into that is maybe half a page, maybe, if I'm being generous. There's more page space dedicated just a chart with some of the different types of undead, and if they require diet, have a craving, or if they are fully dependent on it. And so again, it's a cool section, but I would have liked more. I would have liked more information on it. Then we get some stuff like Undead Society, and again, it's kind of neat, but it just feels a little thin compared to what we really could have had. Like I would have loved some information on like a vampire, like a master vampire or vampire lord, and how they would sort of build their base that supports them, like that services them. The same thing for like a ghoul king, or like how a lich might create a necropolis or a society around it. It's just that stuff's not really in here. You get some like undead gods, which is again okay, but it's just not great, right? And then we get into the player character options, which is it's just a section of the book that I was never interested in. Not just because I'm a DM all the time, so I knew I was never going to get to use any of these options, but like even as a DM making NPCs, I really just didn't want to use any of these options. Like the only one that I do have a soft spot for would have to be the Stitch Flesh Familiar. And again, if Kamikaze Kid, if you're watching this, you're the reason why I actually like this little, this one like feat in the entire book. But yeah, so it's just, we've got that. We also have some undead monster classes. Monster classes in 3rd edition. I might actually dedicate an entire video to this at some point, but monster classes was an idea that I think someone thought was a good one, and it just sucked. So in 3rd edition D&D, you had racial hit dice. So like if you looked at the monster manual, for example, you would probably see that like the ghoul or ghast had 4 hit dice. But then they also have their abilities like stench, paralyzing, like the paralyzing claws or whatever, their paralyzing touch. So because they have those abilities, if you wanted to make a player character of it, some of these more powerful abilities increase what's called the level adjustment, which doesn't affect anything other than like they're basically phantom levels that don't exist. So what they did with monster classes is they tried to incorporate those two things together, the racial hit dice and the level adjustment, to create an actual like supposedly workable class that you could play, that you could go through, and then once you complete going through the monster class, you could start taking levels in player character classes. So basically, yeah, I don't think you could ever really normally like multi-class, or like once you started one of these classes, you could never really multi-class out of them. I do want to say one of the few things that you could do with this one, with these, is that you might be able to start as a living creature first and then start taking these levels. But typically speaking, with a monster class, you had to take them from the very beginning. And once you take a single level in a monster class, you have to take every subsequent level in that monster class before you can do anything else. So, for example, we have like the Morgue here, which has a full 20 level progression. So if you want to get all of the abilities that a Morg has, you have to start at first level as one and go all the way up to level 20. And then you're never going to get a single class level unless you multi-class, multi-class, unless you go into epic levels. Again, I think the only saving grace is that with these ones here, because they were undead that had to come from something living, I want to say that you could take these later after you've had a few levels of like being a living creature before you started taking these. But man, it's just the monster classes were awful. They were just awful, and I don't know any other way to really put it. Like you're never gonna feel like you're the equivalent of, so this Morg, you're never gonna feel like have the equivalent of like 20 levels in a player character class at all. You know, for having some natural armor, some, you know, paralyzing ability, which is based on a DC formula that's not going to be super great because it's based off of like half the hit dice typically of these creatures, meaning that since like the Morg only has 14 hit dice, then like your paralyzing ability, I think it's 10 plus half of that. So at most it's going to be like 17, and then maybe your charisma modifier or something like that. It's just, they're just not good. They're just not good. So again, another section of the book that you're not going to use. And then we get into prestige classes, spells, equipment, like undead grafts. If you wanted to graft an undead limb onto you, you could do that. And then we have our monster section here. So this part was, again, kind of hit or miss, but there were some cool things in here. I really like the Angel of Decay. This has to be my favorite monster from this book, which is basically just like an undead celestial. I thought that was really cool. We have the Atropal, which was one of the final encounters in the Tomb of Annihilation adventure for D&D 5th edition. So this is a creature that definitely made a bit of an impact. But then there's just some other stuff that's like, oh, you know, okay, it might be kind of cool to use, but like, for example, am I ever going to use a desiccator? Probably not. It looks like something out of a Tool video, so I guess that's kind of cool. But like, am I going to use a dire maggot? Like, am I really going to use any of that stuff? You know, probably not for a lot of it. The Entropic Reaper was also kind of cool, but for a level challenge rating 12, it feels under-leveled for something that, you know, should be like a serious threat, because it's kind of like a Grim Reaper, and it's just like, okay, well, like, honestly, a 9th level character or a 9th level party could probably take it. Yeah, I don't know, just again, hit or miss. And then we're just gonna skip through the rest of these. Like, yeah, I mean, like I said, there's some cool stuff in here, and then there's just some other. The Umbral template here, I believe that was from like the Monster Manual 2 or Fiend Folio. So some of this stuff was reprinted from earlier books, updated for 3.5 versus 3.0, but still just kind of meh. Now this section here for the Undead in the campaign, this is actually a pretty good read. Like this, so this section of the book is not bad, and I actually kind of like this a little bit more than I remembered it. So you have like undead masterminds, undead themed campaigns, like Undying Rulers, World of Shadows, The Risen Dead. So there's some really cool stuff in here. So this section of the book, I didn't remember, or sorry, I should say like these 2 pages, I didn't quite remember, but it's still pretty cool, and it's worth a read. Again, though, it's a section of the book that should have been much bigger. Like there should have just been more to it. Then, because actually the undead in the incorporating them into your campaign, that's only a little over a page, maybe a page and a half. Oh, maybe a little over a page and a half. And then we've got running undead encounters. So this is a section that should be really good, should be really useful, because it gives you a ton of different undead from the original Monster Manual, and a round by round sort of breakdown of their tactics. Right? So some monsters in the 3.5 Monster Manual had that, but only a few of them did. So this was something that could have been a huge thing to include. But if you take a look, most of these are like round 1, and then round 2, and then that's it. A few of them go up to round 3. I don't think any of them reach round 4. So again, it's just really kind of weak. Like, so for example, you've got you have the Morg. So the Morg, which is sort of, you know, supposed to be like an intelligent undead. Round 1, attack potentially flat-footed enemy with paralysis tongue. And then round 2 or later, full attack, grappling if possible. Like, does that really need to be listed as a tactic when it's just, okay, just attack things, right? Like, it was such, again, I'll talk a little bit more about like what I feel the theme of this book is. But man, like, this section should have, again, be so much cooler, like go sort of round by round, have different tactics for different situations, like if they get the surprise round, or if, they're outnumbered, or, if, like, there's just so much stuff that they could have done with these tactics, and they took the laziest approach possible, where, again, some of these are just like attack the nearest foe, concentrate attacks on weakened foes, like, it could have been so much more. And then we're going to get into the sample undead. Now, the sample creatures from the Draconomicon, again, was one of the best parts of this book, because the Draconomicon, with dragons in 3rd edition, they were kind of a pain to stat out, because it wasn't like nowadays, where you open the monster manual and you've got like 4 different types of dragon stats to use, from wormling to juvenile or young adult or mature adult, and then ancient. You had like 12 different categories, and you had to sort of stat them out yourself by cross-referencing a couple of different charts, and then filling in some of the blanks like skill points, feats, spells, equipment, things along those lines, right? So it was something that wasn't hard, but it was kind of involved and a little tedious, and the Draconomicon fixed that by statting out every single age category for every single metallic and chromatic dragon from the original monster manual. Now, obviously, this book could not create an undead, like, lich for every single challenge rating possible, right? And I get that, but this was a section that again could have focused on some really cool things like, ghouls, gas, wights, wraiths, shadows. Again, even though they weren't in the original monster manual, death knights, even like the Hukiva, which is one of my favorite types of undead, being a divine spellcaster who tries to turn himself into a lich and screwing it up, and then making it so that they have to, that they basically, it drives them insane and they lose some of their spellcasting ability, and it just, I don't know, I just like the Hukiva. So what we have here are ghosts, which, you get a few different types of ghost, and, it's serviceable, I guess, if you want to use ghosts in your game. They're not my favorite creature to use, but there are people that love them, so I'm not going to say anything really negative about that. At the end of each of these sections, and there's only like 5 of these monsters that they even look at, they do give you some variant types that you can use. So we have like a haunting ghost, or a sagacious ghost, I think it's called. So they possess vast stores of knowledge, making them akin to an undead library. So there's some cool stuff there. And then we get into liches. So the liches are kind of neat here, and I kind of want to focus mainly on like the liches and the vampires, because they're the only 2 that I find are really interesting in this book, and for slightly different reasons. So we have the lich, we got a little bit of information on their phylactery, and then we get into the sample ones here. So one of the things that I will say that I probably didn't like as much back in the day, but for the lich in particular, I actually kind of like the fact that they decided to do this, is instead of focusing on like, every single challenge rating from the minimum that you could have for one up until like CR20, although they do have a CR20 lich in here, which I do appreciate, they decided to just give you some things that you just wouldn't expect. So the very first lich that we have here, Dahlia Thistledown, is a halfling lich bard. Because normally when you think of lich, you think of like wizard, maybe sorcerer, sometimes, maybe cleric. But yeah, the first one that they have here is actually a bard, and I think that that's great. Like, it shows you, with some of these stat blocks, that, hey, you can do stuff that's completely, I don't want to say off the wall, but you can get creative, right? Like, you don't have to make every single lich a wizard. So I like the fact that they did that here, and I don't think I necessarily appreciated that as much back then as I do now. So I will say this is something that I do appreciate quite a bit more. So then we have, the next one we have is just a cleric. Then we have an elven cleric / wizard / mystic thurge, which is a prestige class that's all about just being able to cast both divine and arcane spells. So that's pretty cool. Then we have one that at first I really hated. But again, I've kind of warmed up to it. So we have Krilla Darkhand, and Krilla is, possibly the weakest lich in existence. Because all the liches in this book, and most of the liches that I think everyone's ever made, have always had player character classes. Now in 3rd edition D&D, they introduced NPC classes, which were basically meant to be kind of based on certain archetypes. So you had like the warrior, and I want to say you had like a specialist that was more built around like us being good at a certain number of skills and really nothing else. And then you had the adept. Now the adept had to be the best of the NPC classes. And NPC classes, so they had next to no features whatsoever. Like they were super stripped down, super simplified. The challenge rating modifier for an NPC class was usually like the CR of like whatever your level was, and then like -1. So a 2nd level warrior would only be considered to be a challenge rating of 1, whereas a 1st level fighter would be a challenge rating 1. So like you could have that extra level of warrior, but it still technically wasn't as good as just being a 1st level fighter. So like that's sort of how NPC classes work. But the adept or the adept, they were kind of like the shaman type of character. So if you wanted to make like a shamanistic, NPC, then that was actually a pretty good class for it, because even though they had a very narrow and very like just a very specific selection of spells for the few levels of spells that they could cast, they were drawing from both like the wizard and cleric lists. They had both arcane and divine spells available to them. So you could sort of create that shaman that could cast like burning hands, but also cure light wounds. So it's actually kind of cool that they have this female goblin adept lich, using an NPC class for like a big, scary monster template. It's, again, kind of a cool idea, but something that outside of the adept, I really don't see ever doing ever. But it's something, like I said, I think back in the day I really hated this, but now that I've had, like, I guess I've mellowed out of my old age, I actually really kind of like that. Then up next we just have a Githzerai Lich, and the Githzerai is just a sorcerer and rogue combination. And then we have finally our Archmage Lich, which is an Evoker and an Archmage and a challenge rating 20 version of the Lich altogether. The variant Liches that we get is the Good Lich, which we actually also had in the Monsters of Faerun under the Archlich, I think it was. And then we had the Lich Fiend, which was probably printed for the first time in an actual D&D book here, but it was something that Paizo created for the Shackled City Adventure Path around this time as well, because one of the final encounters against was a Dark Mercule, I think was his name. He was a Lich Fiend, so they have them here as well. And then we've got skeletons, so again, just different types of things turned into skeletons. It's okay. It's something, again, this is something I would probably use just to have a little bit of variety. But that's basically it. You get a few different variant skeletons, like a fiery skeleton, a nimble skeleton. The skeleton soldier is kind of neat because they get +1 to attacks and armor class for each other skeleton that's adjacent to it. Although that is sort of capped by something. And it can also get like weapon focus if it's using an actual weapon. So that's kind of neat. But then we get to, of these like sample stats, this is the one that annoys me and disappoints me the most. So here we have the vampires. Now, again, vampire culture I don't want to say culture, I really don't want to get into that. I don't want to open that can of worms. But vampires as an enemy type, maybe they were kind of on waning during these days, but there should have been a vampire lord in here, right? Like you would think that there was a challenge rating 20 lich. You would think that there would be like a vampire lord or a master vampire in here that you could use as sort of like the basis of a major campaign villain. But there's not. So like the Lich had challenge ratings going from like 11 or 12 all the way up to 20. The vampire challenge ratings go from like 6 to 13. And there's more CRs that are closer to 6 than there are that are closer to 13. So it's just a really weak offering. And while you had some really cool kind of like, again, sort of uncommon types of liches that you would still very much be able to use pretty much all of those in a D&D campaign, you've got some ones here that are just like, okay. I mean, you got like a fiendish Minotaur vampire, so if you want to stack a couple of templates on each other, then you've got this one here. And I know DMs that love to have multiple templates on a single creature, so, all right, fine. That one's fine. Then you have a Drow vampire. Again, you'd probably use that. You might be able to use that in a campaign. But then you got this Sahagin vampire with challenge rating of 11. It's a 7th level cleric and a vampire. And, again, it's neat, but it's kind of limited as to how much you would actually use this. So having like a goblin adept lich, you're probably not going to use that a lot. But seeing something like that and thinking, like, that's kind of cool. Like, I would try to use that somewhere. I don't think I would go through and actually try to use the Sahagin unless I was running something like Ghosts of Saltmarsh, right? Or, those types of, like, the Saltmarsh kind of, like, those types of modules. But as a general campaign, I probably wouldn't use this. Very few of my campaigns have had, like, a strong nautical theme to them. This is just something I probably wouldn't use. The highest CR one that we have here for a vampire is this Fallen Paladin Blackguard turned into a vampire. But again, this should have been a Death Knight because that makes more sense as a Death Knight than a vampire. And again, it's okay. It's something, again, I would probably try to incorporate, but it's just like that's the best one for vampires in my opinion. Then you have a Darrow vampire. So Darrow are these like insane versions or offshoot of like deep dwarves. Again, how often are you going to use Darrow in your game? I mean, you might, but this one I just didn't like. I just didn't enjoy. Like, I just didn't like this one at all. Then you got like the Vampiric Hunter, which is a Yuan-ti vampire ranger. Which again sounds kind of cool, a vampire hunter, or a vampiric hunter, not a vampire hunter, but a vampiric hunter. But again, it's only challenge rating 8. Like, that's just not, it's just, like, that's such a low level for something like that. Like that, I don't know. Again, like, the vampire ones are super weak in my opinion. Then we have a gnome vampiric bard. Like, so the lich bard was kind of neat. I don't know if I'm going to use a vampire bard. And then we have like a bard gargoyle and a bard harpy, or a vampire a gargoyle and a vampire harpy, and that's it. Like that's the vampire types. And I mean, okay, you do get like the psychic vampire, which is kind of cool because I do have a 2nd edition module where they introduce the cerebral vampire, and these things are basically those. They feed off of. Well, actually, this one just feeds off of wisdom, but the other one actually fed off the actual cerebral fluid that surrounds your brain or like is in your spine. So like there's some kind of cool stuff there. And then we get the zombies and some variant zombies. They do have a disease zombie, but it just gives you a normal disease and it doesn't actually create any additional, it doesn't turn you into a zombie if you get bit and die as a result of the disease, which I don't know why they didn't do that. Like, it's such an obvious thing. But again, it's not in there. They also have the fast zombie, which can like move and attack in the same round. Hooray. But yeah, I don't know. And then you get a few like undead cults, a little bit of information on them, which is okay, I guess. Again, some cool concepts. And that's it. Like that's basically the book. A few sample locations, a couple of cults that you have a little bit of information on, and then that's Libris Mortis. So, what are my thoughts on this book after, 17 years? Is it as bad as I remember it? Well, to be fair, there's actually a couple sections of this book that I like a bit more than I remember ever liking. The metabolism section, I thought that was really cool. The different types of like liches I thought was really neat. And some of the variant types of undead that they give you is also kind of cool. The vampires were completely underwhelming in this book, and the fact that they didn't try to incorporate just a vampire lord, like a CR, even like a CR 17, 18, or just, it didn't have to be CR 20, but just something that a high level group could go up against as a major campaign villain. There's just nothing in there. And vampires are one of the more iconic villains that you can use, especially when you think of undead. If I really had to classify this book as something, or if I had to theme it as anything, I would say that the theme of this book is missed potential. Because there was so much stuff that just felt like a no-brainer that you really should have had in here that would have made this book so much better. A section, like, dedicate like 50 pages to various types of undead. Maybe going a bit beyond just the monster manual to have things like Death Knights in there and go over like creation mythologies, or just have some of like the more iconic of those like types of undead appear in there. Like, why not have a pre-Demi-Lich version of not Demi-Lich, but just have like an early Lich version of Vecna, like maybe pre-losing his hand and eye. Maybe why not have Cass in there as a high-powered vampire and go over some of like the vampire creation mythology? Why not have like a really cool like Ghoul King or something like that you could use and go over the creations of how ghouls and gas and wights and wraiths, like just go over some of those, like the very first, or like you could frame it as a legend. Doesn't have to be like the definitive answer to how these things were created, but why not at least try it? And that's the thing that kind of bugs me here, is that it's just there was so much stuff that potentially they could have thrown in there that they just didn't. The Draconomicon had a ton of flavor text, and this book was more focused on the crunchy rules elements of this stuff rather than just being a really fun book to read. Like, to this day, there are times where I'll just pull the Draconomicon off the shelf and just look over some of the stuff on like the dragon anatomies, or some of like the different like layers types that the different chromatic or metallic dragons might have. But I enjoy reading through that because it's just fun to read. And Libris Mortis is just, it's not fun to read. It feels more like a textbook than like a really cool world building RPG book, and it's just really disappointing. So yeah, is it as bad as I remember? Probably not. Like I said, I really, like, at first I hated all of the sample undead that they gave you here for like the liches, and well, I still hate the vampire ones, but like liches, skeletons, zombies. I would have liked to have seen, again, maybe a couple of more types thrown in there. Even if you don't do like Death Knights from the Monster Manual 2, that's fine if you just want to stick to the first Monster Manual. But why not have ghouls? Why not have gas? Why not have wraiths or wights, or just something more than just like ghosts? Okay, all right, that's fine. Liches, obviously, vampires, sure. The skeletons and zombie ones were just like different animals, or different, like, I don't know, it was underwhelming. Even though the skeletons or zombies are probably still like more useful than most of the other ones, I still would have liked a little bit more out of it. And just, having more space dedicated to actually going into the ecologies of these monsters, going into their societies, or going into their creations, or just all of that stuff would have been so much more worth having in there than a bunch of prestige classes or feats or spells, or having, freaking undead grafts where you can graft a zombie arm onto your body, right? Like, there's just so much missed potential in this book, and Draconomicon was near perfect, and like no book is perfect, but Draconomicon was probably as close to perfect as you're likely going to get. And Libris Mortis is just it just falls so flat compared to the expectations that were set by the Draconomicon. It's hard for me to look back at this as anything other than a disappointment. Is it as bad as I remember it? No, but it's not much better than I remember it. So I guess that's where I am. So again, sorry, dude. Kamikaze Kid, I know this is one of your favorite books. Just doesn't do it for me, but, hey, there are definitely worse books out there, like that 3.0 Sonic's Handbook. And yeah, so there's more books that I want to do this series on. I also want to take the opposite approach and look at some of the books that I look at very fondly and see if they're actually as good as I remember. And Draconomicon is probably going to be one of the earliest ones for that, although I kind of gave away a lot here, so I might focus on something else before I get to that book. But anyway, there are some other books that I want to do in this series, so I might actually try to throw a poll up on YouTube that you can vote on, list like 2 or 3 options and see which one you guys pick there. But I do enjoy doing this. It gives me the opportunity to go back and look at a book that I probably haven't opened since in like 15 years. I probably haven't looked at this book beyond the first few months after it came out. So if nothing else, it was kind of cool to go back and have some of like the nostalgic memories. And hopefully one of these times I'll look at a book that I really remember hating and like, you know what, it's actually pretty good. Unfortunately, Libris Mortis just doesn't get there. So it's a little better than I remember it, but that's about it. So anyway, let me know in the comments below. If any of you own this book in your collection, what are your thoughts on it? If you have the entire Monster Ecology series like Draconomicon, Libris Mortis, Lords of Madness, the Fiendish Codex 1 and 2, Drow of the Underdark, let me know where you might rank this in that particular subseries. Would you rank it as like the weakest? Is it your favorite? Is it somewhere in between? So let me know that in the comments below as well. Have you used any of the stat blocks or any of the monsters from here? Or if as you were a player, did you play any of the prestige classes? So I always like to hear that kind of stuff. And again, like I never want any of these books to be like, you know, every book that comes out, I want there to be people that love it, even if I'm not one of them. Because, look, people worked hard on this book. Even if it's not something that I personally would have gone for or that I personally like or appreciate, I still can at least respect the amount of work and time that went into creating it. So, yeah, I mean, I really do hope that there are people out there that, like, this is one of their favorite books. So, you know, I'm sure there are. And if you're one of those people, you know, not just Kamikaze Kid, but if you're one of those people, let me know that in the comments as well, because I always want to see like these books succeed, even if they don't reach me, even if they don't, you know, grab me personally. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Take care.